My objective today is to explain to you how you can integrate crisis planning into your business strategy. Because in my view, crisis planning is in fact part of your business, and it's the way to protect yourself and your reputation as an organization. I'm going to share with you some frameworks that help you to identify and prioritize the tasks that you need to do in order to do effective crisis planning. And I'm going to we're going to talk about some mitigation planning that you can do once you've identified crises. And hopefully prepare you to act decisively when stuff happens. So let's start with what is a crisis. A crisis really is anything that has the ability to disrupt your normal business operations. And of course, one of the most recent and most infamous examples is when the CEO of a company was caught with his paramour, HR director, at a Coldplay concert. I'm sure that the people at the company did not expect to have to deal with the fallout of that, nor did he or the HR person. But those are the kinds of things that really can affect a company's reputation and the things that you have to worry about when you're building your crisis plans. So it's not just a system breakdown or a process failure. It's actually going into, excuse me, it's going into other things beyond just the normal operations of the business. Crises can be self-inflicted. I would suggest that the Coldplay incident was. It can be an accident. We've all, as engineers, have seen workplace accidents where people have had injuries, workplace injuries, and God help us, deaths from time to time. Or it can be a series of critical incidents that are unrelated but somehow come back to you. So for example, it might be that a major project is being planned that has financing behind it. The financing collapses, then the maybe something that you were trying to sunset fails, and all of a sudden you find yourself unable to meet the demands of your organization. So when you're thinking about crisis management, crisis preparation, it's a cycle, and you're always in some part of the cycle. You may be in different parts of the cycle in different parts of your business. But if we start with preparation, it's knowing what might happen and preparing for the things that might happen. And then the crisis hits and you start to manage the crisis. And that requires a different set of skills and a different team perhaps that's managing the crisis. And then gradually you start to come out of crisis mode and you begin to recover. And the recovery phase can take years depending on what the crisis is or was. And then once you've recovered, you start to prepare again for maybe a different kind of crisis or a different iteration of the crisis you just had, because there are other things that are factors. And I call this the resilience cycle, because when you are really working that cycle of prepare, manage, recover, and you're doing it as a cycle all the time, you will be much more resilient as an organization in the way you deal with the crises that come up. I'm going to stop there and ask if there's any questions. I'm assuming there are none.
I think you're good to keep going.
Okay, let's go to the next slide, Evelyn, please. So when you're thinking about being resilient to whatever might happen, you need to make crisis preparation or preparedness a priority. And that means really taking the time to think about what might happen in your business. When I look at crisis preparation as a business priority, I think about it as uh, building it in. And what I have also found is when people do this well, they actually uncover things that will increase the efficiency of their businesses at the same time they're doing the crisis preparation. So it's really an interesting exercise, very much like building a business strategy or a plan to go forward. When you're doing your reputation resilience work, you're going to have to know what your risks are. What are the risks for your business? That doesn't mean that you need to anticipate everything that happens, but you absolutely have to know what those risks might be and start thinking about what are the things that you do to mitigate those. You can't prepare for everything. So what you need to do is number 3 is prioritize your business risks. And you might work on 1 or 2 at a time to build a plan to mitigate the risks that you've got. And then you need to activate a crisis team. So if one of those risks became a crisis, who in your organization will be the ones taking care of the situation and making sure that they have the training and the tools necessary to do that? And when you're ready, you need to test your plan. Usually that's a tabletop exercise that you run. See where the gaps might be in your planning or in the team that you've got. And then after you've tested, you evaluate, refine, and practice. Let's go on to the next slide. So this comes into the know your risks category. And by the way, I can send these slides out to you. And there will be other things that I can give you to give you these because I know these slides are huge. But in my practice, I've found that really there's only 10 categories of risks that people might run into in their businesses. Technology and cybersecurity is obviously a big one these days. Health, safety, and the environment for those of you who are operating manufacturing facilities or have operations that require the movement of equipment. Those are also big. I have to tell you, I'm a bit of a safety geek. So even when I was working inside an office, I was always worried about file cabinets tipping over and not being appropriately tethered to the wall. So, it can be anywhere. There's natural and operational disasters. So what happens if a critical part of your process fails? What about if you had a power shutdown that was out of your control, or there was an earthquake, or I remember when I first moved to Ontario, I was working close to the steel mills, and we had a catastrophic snowstorm. Think White Swan for you guys, where the power to the steel mills was shut down and they had to shut down their smelters. So, things like that can happen. What if you had a product or quality issue? Maybe you issued some products that are off spec. You need to recall them. Financial, we've talked about, finances where the interest rates may be there or your capital fund has collapsed in some way. You may have industry issues. So there may be regulations that affect your business that may be important for you and may cause some sort of a retraining or a reputation issue. You may be offside to those employee relations and labor disputes. What if you have a strike? What if you have a union organizing? What if you have a wrongful dismissal and you have some unrest as a result of that? You can have legal issues with trademarks, copyright infringements, those kinds of things. ethics and social stuff. So we combine that with the employee relations side, and that would be the cold play situation. And then miscellaneous stuff like travel policies. I had a company I worked with, and they had their executive team go on a retreat every year to a third world country where they did work and charitable work, but they all traveled on the same plane. And I had to encourage them to come up with a succession plan, so that if something happened, if there was an airplane crash or a bus crash when they were being transported, that there were ways for the business to recover from that. Okay, so any questions at this point on
There
risk
is a question.
categories?
Oh, sorry, there is a question in the chat. It says, where does government regulation fall?
Um, I would put that into legal and also into a little bit into industry member issues. So if the government put together a policy that affected the way in which you could operate your business, that would come into one of these categories. You could make it a miscellaneous one. If you're highly regulated, you may make it as a separate risk category. Does that answer the question for the person?
They said thank you, so I'm assuming yes.
Okay. Any more, Emma?
That's all so far. And just a reminder to all the attendees, you are able to unmute yourself to ask questions. You can raise your hand or you can type in the chat, and I'm happy to address them.
Thanks, Emma. That's a good reminder. And now, Evelyn, would you advance the slide, please? So once you've identified all the risks that you might have as an organization, now what you need to do is spend a little time really talking about what they are. So a description, what might happen? What is the impact that that would have on your organization or on your business? And what are your recovery goals if it happened? So let's say, for example, everyone's thinking about bringing people back either full-time or part-time to work. What if there was a fire in your physical facility that required people to evacuate the premises? And how quickly would you want to recover your operations in your office? When we had the pandemic, how quickly were you able to, or could you reestablish your operations? Where are the files? Where are the computers? How do we do that? How do we bring people in? So how quickly do you want to do that? What does the operation look like when you're recovering? And then you look at prevention measures. What are you doing to prevent it from happening in the first place? So if your business is highly dependent on a power supply, and we all know that sometimes in Nova Scotia the power goes out because of windstorms and that kind of thing, perhaps we should be looking at backup power to handle the critical equipment that we have. Or we may look at having file storage in multiple locations, or we may have individuals in different offices in different parts of the country who can pick up when we're out of operations. And then once you've sort of looked at those prevention measures, what are you doing to continually make sure that those measures that are preventing things, what checks do you have to make sure that those systems are still working? I go back to the fun story when Elon Musk took over Twitter, and he fired everybody. And the one guy he fired was the guy that had the key to the office. He had to hire him back. I think it doubled the salary in order to get the keys to open the office so people could come into the work. So that's the kind of thing you might look at. And then who is accountable for the ongoing monitoring? So if you identify the who and they know they're accountable, then that is their responsibility to make sure that systems are operating as they should and that they put their hand up when it's not. So you identify what your risks are, and then you look at them with these lenses. Are there any questions at this point?
I don't see
Okay.
any at this time.
Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. So once you know what your risks are, you can prioritize them by looking at them by impact and probability in a grid like this. And you'll plot them and see where the red zones are. Hopefully you don't have 25 red zone ones to deal with. But in that red square, that would be things that would shut your business down or potentially stop you from doing business altogether. Whereas an orange one might be that you're out of business for a couple of days, or there's a huge impact in the sales for a few days, but it's highly unlikely that it happens. So you maybe do a little less risk planning around it. The blue category, I always put HR into this category because people get hired and terminated fairly quickly. Usually companies have systems in place to handle those things well. It happens rarely that you terminate someone's employment. Hopefully it has a minimal impact on the business when that happens. And usually HR has systems in place to make sure it's done well, so you're not facing lawsuits. On the other hand, there may be things that happen frequently, but don't have a lot of impact on the business. You just have to make sure that you've got checks and balances in your systems so that those are taken care of. So this priority map, the risk map, helps you for two things. It helps you to prioritize which risks you're going to fully plan for. It is also a wonderful tool for reporting to boards of governors, senior executives, to show them where you are in your risk planning and where you need to go. So you can show how you've mitigated risks and so on by moving things along, and use this as a talking piece. I've done this for a couple of organizations where I've actually done the plots for them for their risks. And it really helps the conversation with executives as well as with planning teams to understand where they fit in, where these risks fit in how they should be looking at the business. Any questions at this point?
Nothing typed at this time or any raised.
Okay, so if you were in that red square or any other square that you want it to be in, go ahead, Evelyn, and progress. And you're going to prepare for one risk at a time. You can't do them all. The last organization I did a risk map for, I think we had 85 identified risks, so we weren't going to do planning for all of them. But when you're building your plan to help you, here's some questions to ask. So what is it that might happen? What would it mean to your organization in business terms? What are your objectives for recovery if it happens? What are you doing now? And what checks do you have in your policies, your work processes, et cetera, to monitor the risk level, and who's accountable for the ongoing monitoring? So that becomes a relatively detailed plan around a particular risk. Moving on. Next slide, please. And that's where you build this risk tactical template. So you take the risk, and you see my questions are there, and you put some goals around it, and you put some action plans around it. Sometimes you're going to need to do some work in order to be ready to act when a crisis strikes, and sometimes it'll just be monitoring what's going on. The key one on this template, the risk tactical plan, is the who. Too often, organizations will delegate the who or make the who the team. And frankly, the team doesn't work. In a crisis, you need an individual who also has a surrogate or a backup, but an individual who is the person who is going to be accountable for managing the situation and the risk and has all the things they need to do that. I think I saw a question pop up.
It was a comment that someone really likes this template.
Okay. All right, let's move on. Next slide, please. So I talked about having an individual monitoring your risk and being there, but when you're planning your strategy for how to deal with the crisis, you need to determine roles for different people. And a lot of people think that the executive or the board should be the ones that are driving everything. That may be the case in some smaller businesses. In larger businesses, the executive and the board are consumers of information about the risk. They certainly need to know that something has happened. At the same time, they may be the ones who enable the team to get the money they need, the resources they need in terms of human resources or other resources in order to recapture operations. So they aren't necessarily the active members of a crisis team. You need to select the people on the team for their expertise and skills, not their level of management. And my example here is if you have a social media presence and you've got a social media manager, chances are that person is not on the board or on the executive. But if you have a reputational crisis where you have to respond to things online somehow, you need to have the person who knows how to access all your accounts on the team so that they can be doing the things they need to do in order to recover. Who has the password to the website, who can get the thing unlocked to put some sort of a message up on your website, provide ongoing information through your social channels, your intranet if you have one, all those kinds of things. You need to have the person who has the key. So when Elon got fired the guy that had the key, he had to hire him back. Don't forget, those people need the skills. They also need to have alternates. The chances of you having your A team that you've selected as your crisis team available when the crisis hits are next to nil. Somebody's going to be on vacation, somebody's sick, somebody's on leave, out of the country, whatever. So make sure that you have me and someone else who can do my role on the team when the crisis hits. And here's a key: provide training. Make sure they know who they are, know what their responsibilities are for being on the team, and have some training for doing the things they need to do. So, for example, if you have a war room for your operations in a crisis, make sure those people know how to get there. Make sure that they understand what it is they'll be expected to do. If any of them are going to be expected to speak publicly, give them some public speaking training, that kind of thing, so that they are completely in line with what they need to do. Train the team and train their alternates. And then practice, practice, practice. Run simulations, try it out, have someone missing. Do whatever you need to do to make sure that the team is ready. I'm just going to say one more thing here about activating the team. If someone indicates that they do not want to be on the team, and that's entirely possible, let them opt out. My situation that I can tell you about is I was working at a company. I had the person who was responsible for putting together all of our crisis plans and making sure we were ready to respond in any way that we needed to. She was a wonderful person. She thought everything through. But when the crisis struck, she became completely paralyzed. She wasn't able to operate in that kind of a stressful environment. So talk to your team members about whether they think they can, in fact, operate in that kind of an environment, and give them a role that's suitable for them, or get someone else to do what you wanted them to do. I'm going to pause there for some questions and a drink.
Again, you are able to type any questions in the chat or unmute yourself to ask questions that you have as well.
Okay. Yep. Thank you, Evelyn. Your anticipatory skills are great. So let's say the crisis hit and it's time for the team to take action. Make sure they're empowered to act and they don't need to ask for permission to do what they've been trained to and asked to do. For example, if they need money, if they need to hire external consultants, make sure that they can do that without going through multiple levels of the organization to find what they need. They need to know who they are. I've already talked about that. And here's one that a lot of people forget. You need to be able to find these people every day, all day, 7 days a week. And that means that these team members are going to have to give you all of their relevant contact information. You may need to, you may need to find them on email. You may need to find them on a phone. They may have multiple phones. They may have a home phone, although not many people do that now. You may want to get them on a social account. However you need to find them. If they've got a cottage and the cottage doesn't have cell and the cell service or internet service, you want to be able to reach them some other way. You might need to have the address of the cottage if they're really critical to the team, or you may have to reach out to their surrogate, but they need to be accessible to you round the clock, 7 days a week. They need a defined role. So when someone initiates the team, activates the team, they need to know my role on the team is to do this. And they may have another team that's working with them underneath of that. I've talked about being comfortable in the roles. And here's my other tip. Don't be totally reliant on technology. There are times when good old Bell, TELUS, whatever service you're using isn't accessible. They're offline. You may need to use telephones. You may need to use couriers or whatever it happens to be, but you may have to have other ways to reach people other than through technology. And that would also include the plans. If you've got plans that are built and you have to reach out to read those or something, you still need that. And once again, the importance of being trained and having drills is important. When a crisis strikes, the other thing that you need is a team captain, someone who's going to pull the team together and really announce the crisis. We have to pull everyone into the room and do this. So you have to make sure that the person or persons who have defined roles as team leaders know that they're empowered to tap into the team and they have the access to their contact information. I'm going to pause there for any questions that people might have. Okay, Evelyn, can you go 2 slides ahead, please? So when the crisis happens, you need a whole lot of things to get done. And from a communications perspective, there may be things that you need to say publicly. And part of your preparations may be getting ready for that. I can tell you that lawyers can really put a fly in the ointment, if you will, if they may be worried about lawsuits that may come out of the crisis. And it's important to involve them in your crisis planning and make sure that you and the team understand what it is that you can and cannot say in certain circumstances. Most lawyers these days understand that not saying anything and no comment doesn't work. They can really help you with your crisis planning. So get them on board before anything happens and make them part of your planning process. And in some cases, you'll have a lawyer on your crisis team. Having some basic fill in the blank statements ready is a good idea for some of the crises that may happen where you need to speak to your employees, your suppliers, your customers, and possibly even the general public. I'm not a big fan of having everything written out because I can tell you that the crisis never happens the way you think it might happen. But at least having a checklist or something that tells you, oh, yeah, I got to do this, 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 and this will really help with your planning. And when you're in the crisis, to remind you, they're great, great to have there. You also need a speedy approval process. There's something called the golden hour, which has been shrunk by social media to the golden minute. You need to get things out in minutes to respond. And if you don't, what you do is you find yourself, the crisis is being managed by other people, by rumors, by innuendo. People will fill the silence with their own points of view. So you need to have things ready to go quickly. And you need, again, going back to that team needs to be empowered to act. They can't wait for the CEO to get out of a board meeting or to get off a plane. They need to take action. I've mentioned this before. Know the passwords. Know what the online accounts are. Know how to get into them. Know how to shut them down. Know what you can put up on them. And take control of the information flow. Don't speculate. So say what you know when you know it. And if you still need to gather information, just say, we're looking for more information. We'll be back to you in a couple of hours. Even if you're coming back every couple of hours and you've got nothing new to say, you are making your commitments and coming back and doing that, so telling people what's going on. And please, please, please train any spokespeople you have. Make sure that they are prepared to stand in front of a scrum if there was an accident that may have endangered human life or human lives were lost. Make sure that they're ready to stand in front of a scrum and answer questions from the media and have that practice. Okay, any questions on managing the moment? Or activating the team for that matter?
Nothing in the chat at this time.
Okay, I'm going to talk now. Evelyn, if you can go back to the second slide. We've talked about preparation. We've talked about managing the moment. Now let's just talk a little bit about recovery. Here's the reality. The crisis that happens will be with you forever. It will always be a part of your history. It will always be a part of your reputation. And when the cameras are off or when the emergency is over, it's time to start the recovery process. And in the recovery process, hopefully, you will be able to do things differently, better, to help prevent that same crisis from happening again. You need to understand that you need to make commitments to your employees, your customers, your suppliers, the general public, the government, regulators, all those people, you're going to be making commitments to them. Make sure that the commitments you make to them are in fact doable and that you have the ability to do them in a particular point of time. Now, some instances, you're going to be managing a crisis, perhaps where there's a workplace accident, and you're going to have regulators in during the crisis, and they'll be helping you recover. Working with them and understanding what their needs are, making commitments to them and fulfilling those as you go along is going to go a long way to your recovery. People will remember how you made them feel during the crisis, and they'll remember what you said you were going to do and whether you did that. God forbid you have another crisis of a similar nature before you fully recovered. People are going to put a microscope on what you promised to do. And that's why that recovery phase is really important. And you start your preparations all over again. And that's why it's resilient. One other thing I'm going to say is preparation. You can't prepare for the crisis exactly the way it's going to happen. It will happen in a different way. There will be nuances. But if you've prepared, if you've really prepared well for your crises, you will have the flexibility and the agility within your team to respond. If they've never seen the situation before or never contemplated something like that, they really may look like they are scrambling. And the worst thing you can do in a crisis is look like you're scrambling. You really need to bring back that control as quickly as you can and start to manage the situation. If you think about the way air crashes are handled, obviously there's all kinds of regulatory people that are around that crisis. The airlines is in there, the airports are in there, but you need to make sure that you understand what your role is, what their role is. You may even assign team members whose sole job will be to what's the word I'm looking for? Be the liaison between the regulator and the company during the crisis so that those relationships are set. And in the recovery phase, then that relationship really helps to make sure the recovery happens perhaps faster and certainly in a more positive way than it might have been otherwise. Are there any questions about the resilience cycle or the cycle itself or any part of it? Okay, let's go to the penultimate slide. Evelyn, I'm testing your moving. There you go. I've written a book about crisis preparation called Stuff Happens, and I'm offering each of you on this call a free copy of the book. If you go to this this URL, you will find that you can get the book there. And it has the risk categories in there, the risk tactical plans in there, the heat map, which is the prioritization of the risks, and a whole lot more on the communication with some examples of things that have happened and how different organizations have dealt with it. So with that, I'm going to really open it up to questions and ask me anything.
I've got not so much a question, but more of a comment. I appreciate you doing this webinar because I had no idea that my company, which is relatively big, has a lot of good information on our intranet. Kind of surprising. I've been with this particular company for 6 years, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone in local calls talk about crisis planning or response. So I get, maybe it is later a question. How do you think I should bring up to my local team to say, hey, we should have a call to discuss this, where, you know, our company is really focused on billability, and this takes time away from that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and you know, there's lots of people that are caught flat-footed because they haven't done the planning. In the book, I talk about the business case for doing crisis planning, and the business case is very simple. If a crisis happens, you're losing money really fast. So a small investment in the planning part will help to mitigate those losses if a crisis did happen. The other thing that I have found, and this has been universal for me, is when companies do crisis planning, they will often, you know how we had that list of things that could happen, they will often find as they go through that list of risks that they've got, that there are processes that they are doing or things that they're doing that are actually putting them more at risk, or they're not as efficient as they could be, or there are redundancies or conflicts. And that in itself can actually recover money by the process. You know, we often do brainstorming and that kind of thing. So I call this putting your black hat on and doing some black hat kind of thinking. What happens when, you know, when the sky is falling? Be Chicken Little for a bit. And it really does have a payout. And my experience with this is people are much easy, they find it much easier to come up with all the things that could go wrong than they do in freewheeling on what they might do next to get the next big product. Does that help you?
Yeah, I think so. I feel like there's like a disconnect between leadership priorities and then local project teams sometimes. But I mean, we
Yeah.
could discuss that for for a long time,
Forever,
so I don't
yeah.
want to.
That's a systemic issue. But I think, you know, starting with your own team and doing that. You may find ways to do it. It's really writing the business case. You know, if you're writing a proposal to do crisis planning, it's like writing a proposal for your next big investment. You know,
Mhm.
it really does come down to that. And it is a business imperative. I mean, if you were facing millions of dollars of losses, but you could mitigate those losses by having five people in a room for half a day doing some crisis planning, it seems like it's a no-brainer. But getting people to think that way is different. The other thing I find is that a lot of leaders think, oh, we can handle it no matter what, you know, but they don't understand the human cost of handling that crisis or how important it is to have the right people around. You know, the person who has who's your web designer or your internet designer, they're on vacation somewhere, you know, going up Mount Everest, and there's no way to get them, and no one else has that information. So finding out where information sits is also a big thing. But start with your team.
Okay, thank you.
We do have a couple questions in the chat, but I see that Shelley has her hand up, so I'm going to let Shelley go first.
Okay.
Hey, thank you very much, by the way, for the free book. That's very generous of you. I was wondering if you could tell us an example of one of the crises that you've been involved in and how it evolved and how you recovered.
Oh my, lots. I have to be careful about which ones I tell you about. I think I'm going to tell you one that's older. Um, some of you may remember when SARS hit Toronto. And at that time, I was working for Deloitte. And SARS didn't affect our firm very much because we didn't have anyone that had SARS or whatever. But around that same time, there was concern about the H1N1 virus and that it could potentially cause, wait for it, a pandemic. And we sat down as a team and did planning around pandemic planning for H1N1. And we did a lot of things. We looked at, how much cash did we need to have in order to give people money if they needed it or get things done? How much cash do we need in our safe? We identified people that would do different things in different parts of the country, for example. We got all that planning done. And when we step back and look at the pandemic, what we got wrong in our planning was that the pandemic truly was pandemic. We thought that if the pandemic struck, it would strike in Halifax and the Winnipeg office could take over, or it would strike in Toronto and the Montreal office could take over. So we felt we were covered geographically that way. And in reality, as we all know, when the pandemic hit, that wasn't the way it worked. I'm also going to take you back to Deloitte for something else. We were one of the host firms for the Vancouver Olympics in 2010. And we decided that it would be a good idea then to find out if we could have all of our people in Vancouver work remotely. And we built systems to allow them to work remotely. And we tested those systems, making sure we had our cybersecurity in place and everything else. That work in 2010, combined with our work in H1N1 after SARS, came together when the pandemic hit. All of the people that worked were able to work from wherever they were with their computers and get the business done. So interesting ways of looking at it. It was a different configuration. Another one, I've done product recalls where I've had to deal with retailers and get products off shelves. And sometimes you think it's not going to be a big news story, and sometimes it is. So one of the product recalls I did became a big news story. And in addition to all the logistical work for getting the product back and making sure we had everything, was dealing with the media who were creating all kinds of wonderful what if scenarios for people that were dying or could die because they had consumed these products.
Thank you. Do you want me to address some of the questions? Shelley, did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Shelley, is there something in your industry that you'd be interested in talking about? Because I've done a lot of other industry stuff too.
No, I'm retired, but I work with the government, and we had I work with labor, so we did have some crises that we ran into. But I was just interested in the examples that you might have run into that could cause issues.
Yeah, the one company I told you about where everyone was traveling together, this was a big deal for them. But they didn't think that having the entire executive on a single engine plane in the third world, and then getting on a bus in the third world was a big deal, until we realized that if anything had happened to that bus or anything had happened to that plane, no one could sign checks. No one had the authority to issue the payroll. They didn't have authority to do a whole lot of things. So we had to set up a shadow cabinet for when they were away to make sure all the signing authorities were done, and a succession plan that was kept secret, but a succession plan. So if the CEO dies in a plane crash, this is the person that takes over. And by the way, it can't be one of the people that was on the plane with them. Just FYI.
I'm just going to move to some of the questions in the chat because we do have some good ones. The first one is, any tips for if your crisis approval process / decision making relies on input from external people such as clients and regulators who may be slow providing a response?
that is part of the planning process. If there's a regulatory thing, go back to workplace safety. If there's injuries in a plant or something like that, you're going to have the regulator looking over your shoulder. In your preparations, work with them. So if this happened, what do you need? And make sure that there's some boilerplate stuff that you can put out with blanks in it to describe the situation that don't step over the line of the regulator. If you think about a plane crash, for example, you'll very often hear the airline will say, our flight XYZ from here to here has gone down. We don't believe there's any survivors, but we're working with the authorities now to get more information. And that's all they need to say. You don't give information out unless you have factual information to give.
Our next question is, when and how often is it recommended to review this process?
About once a year in general. And it depends on the size of your organization and the nature of the risks you've got. If you're running an office of consultants, for example, once a year to review what your plan might be is probably adequate. But if you're running a power plant or a nuclear facility or a pulp and paper mill, whatever it happens to be, you may need to do more, and you may look at different areas of the business with your reviews.
Thank you. Are there any guidelines for how much time, example, as a percentage, a leadership team should spend on crisis preparedness?
Not in terms of time, but I think what's important here is to make it integrated into the business planning generally. So I think it's incumbent upon a leadership team to really understand what the risks are to their business and to operate accordingly and give it the attention it deserves based on the nature of the risks. And that's when you go back to that heat map where, it's what the impact would be and what the probability of the risk might be. Also, another thing that, going back to the previous question, if you have key people leaving the business, you need to retrain your team.
Very important. Next question is, I'd like to know how important it is to document a crisis, its impact, and the management measures taken. Who is typically responsible for this documentation? Does some crisis occur again and again? If it does, how can those documenting it be useful?
They can be useful in the recovery phase and how you're going to do things differently. If it happens the second time, just like the first time, shame on you. You really should be doing a continuous improvement piece. Documentation becomes very important, especially if there's a possibility of litigation. So I was involved with a crisis at a bank where we had some malfeasance, and documenting what was done, by whom, and at what time, time-stamping things was important. We actually had someone on the crisis team whose responsibility it was to keep the record. And that way, the lawyer had everything they needed to go to the next step. And sometimes it's the lawyer themselves that will be that person on the team. In my particular case, it was not, but it was someone that knew what the lawyer needed and kept copious records of what was going on. And in that case, I think we had 4 or 5 different lawsuits that had to be resolved.
Thank you. I will just note we have about 2 minutes left, so if there's any last minute questions, please feel free to either unmute yourself and ask them or type in the chat. If not, while everyone's still on the call, I just want to give a very big thank you to Jacqui for your presentation, and a reminder that we will be sending you an email with the PD survey. I think someone did raise their hand. I'm not sure if that was a question or an accidental reaction.
I'm seeing thumbs up and clapping, but I'm not seeing
lots
any
of clapping. thank you everyone for joining. Again, if there's any last minute questions, we do have about 2 minutes left. Lots of appreciative claps.
And if you're interested, you're going to get the Stuff Happens book if you want to get that. The other thing that you might be interested in, I send out a newsletter once a week on a Tuesday. It's topics related to leadership. And so if you would like that, just pop me an email and let me know. I think when you get the book, you have an opportunity to sign up for the newsletter. I have been privileged to have this hour with you, and I want to thank you so much for your attention and your questions. I hope that I've given you some food for thought and that you go forward doing some things to prepare for whatever crises may come your way, and that you have the agility to do so when they happen.